Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the book launch of Ecology of Dakota Landscapes, Past, Present, and Future by W. Carter Johnson and Dennis H. Knight. My name is Emmeline Weber, and I'm the Library Operations Manager here at Briggs Library. We are delighted to have both authors here today to talk about the book and the creation process. There will be a Q&A session following remarks from Dr. Johnson and Dr. Knight. Before we get started, we have just a few announcements. There are copies of the book available for purchase at the desk here, thanks to the Agricultural Heritage Museum. I'm told there are only 10 copies left, so if you want a physical copy today, run over and get it real quick. Otherwise, we also have information about where to buy it online. There's also an exhibit outside the archives on Dr. Johnson's work. Today's program is accessible to a remote audience over Zoom, thanks to technical equipment funded by the South Dakota Humanities Council. To be notified about library events such as this, please sign up for our Friends of the Library newsletter in the back. Also, we want to acknowledge that South Dakota State University sits on the ancestral lands of the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Knight are both South Dakota natives who led distinguished careers studying and teaching ecology. Dr. Johnson is a professor emeritus of South Dakota State University, and Dr. Knight is a professor emeritus of the University of Wyoming. In Ecology of Dakota Landscapes, the authors look at the natural and man-made forces behind the shaping of the native ecosystems and croplands of the northern Great Plains. There are remarks on the prairie pothole region, the Missouri River and the Black Hills, as well as grasslands, woodlands, sandhills, buttes, shelter belts, and rivers, lakes, and wetlands. The book also discusses restoring landscapes, sustainable land management, and impacts of climate change in both South and North Dakota. Dr. Johnson and Dr. Knight begin their book with this quote from prairie ecologist John Weaver. "Nature is an open book. Each grass-covered hillside is a page on which is written the history of the past, conditions of the present, and predictions of the future. Let us look closely and understandingly and act wisely in time bring our methods of land use and conservation activities into close harmony with the dictates of nature." And now please welcome Dr. Carter Johnson and Dr. Dennis Knight.
It's great to see this nice crowd. Wow, exciting. You never quite know what you might get in a part of a pandemic. I guess it's sort of getting rough out there or something. But nice to see everybody, and I see a lot of familiar faces. And as I was saying in a few minutes, there's some people that were involved in producing the book in the audience here. So there's a lot of support for that. I appreciate that. Booksellers call this event a launching. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's a strange thing. I don't see a ship in a champagne bottle anywhere, but that's what they call the launching. And then I got to realizing, well, it does apply to this book. Our book was on a Chinese ship leaving China about a month or two ago, and it was launched, but it got stuck in Chesapeake Bay. And so it sat there for a month. So this event was really sort of scheduled for a month before, but it sat there for a month until they could get it loose and relaunch. So instead of launching, it got stuck in the mud, I guess that's the way of saying it. First, I want to thank Emmeline and Michelle and their staff for putting this together. What a beautiful place to be doing this. And I keep thinking, launching a book when you're surrounded by books is the most wonderful thing to have. So it's a great place to be, and they've done a great job in putting this all together and giving us a chance to even be here, of course. There are a few organizations that helped us out financially to produce the book. The Biodiversity Institute at the University of Wyoming came forth with what they call a subvention. Now, I'm not going to define that word for you because it would take about 5 minutes to do it, but you can look it up. Basically, it allows Yale to sell the book at a cheaper price, and also allows us to use as much color in the book as we wanted. So it was a very important contribution. The other contribution was the Natural Resource Management Department helped fund the graphic portion of the book. A lot of graphics had to be redone for the book, and they were helping and getting us funding that. So that's another thing. Also, the book, is, if you've all seen it, is got the names, excuse me, Johnson and Knight on the cover. But there's a lot more names that should have been there or could have been there. If you open the book and look at Acknowledgments, you'll see a very long list of people that helped in one way or another for us to produce the book. Some of them produced or gave photographs for us to use. Some of them reviewed parts of the manuscripts, and we were looking things over. Others gave information. Some of them had done research that we actually used as part of the book. So it's a very long list, and so the book is really a composite of all of those people, some of whom are here, and the two of us with our experience in putting together a book of this type. So I wanted to make those acknowledgments. You might wonder how this project got started. Every time you talk to somebody about starting a book, it seems like they have a different approach and a different reason why they got it started. But Dennis and I were on a fishing trip, and we were talking about books and science and so on, and we came up with the idea that he had just finished a book on Wyoming called Mountains and Plains, and we said, well, we don't have a book like that for South Dakota. Minnesota has one. Wyoming has one. We need to get involved and get it. We've got just as much to show as they do. So that sort of got us going. We were not in a bar. We were just driving down the road when we made that decision. So then we got to thinking about what we had agreed to do and thinking, well, how hard is that going to be to write this book? And I don't know. I was thinking in part, well, we both grew up in South Dakota, born and raised and educated in South Dakota. So, and then I came back for 30 more years after a stint in the Southeast. And wouldn't that be enough don't we know enough to write this book? Just sit down and start writing. So I said, yeah, I'm going to start writing the Missouri River chapter, which is one of my research areas. And I did a paragraph or two, and then I got stumped. There was a number I didn't have, and I got stumped on a name for something, and I thought, well, I better look up some of that stuff. I started looking up stuff, and to my surprise, I thought there wouldn't be very much information available out there. I started finding stuff all over the place. Now, it wasn't all large books on the subject, but they were small pieces of things, some of them even in gray literature, which is not usually available to most people. So what it ended up being, with that search for a few new sources, in the back of the book there's a bibliography of 900 entries. So we found we found more than 900, but we didn't use it all. So the point is that there is a lot of information out there. It's sort of disparate. It's in lots of different places. And I guess our main task was to sort of pull it together and synthesize it. And so if somebody wants to think about this or work on the subject or wants information on the subject, they don't have to go to all these different places. Now it's all in one book. Now I can't say that all the information ever written on South and North Dakota is in the book, but we picked out what we thought would be the most appropriate information. So what that means is there are superscripts in the text, and let's say we say there's a fact, a number or something, and there's a number 6, and you go in the back and you can find the source for that number. Now you don't have to do that. The numbers are really tiny, and the little superscripts. So it doesn't change your reading at all, but it does give you information that, you can't just say stuff, right? I mean, some people do that. but you can't just say stuff. You've got to sort of find your sources, and you've got to prove it. So there's a lot of stuff in the back that could be useful to some folks. Now, other people tell me, and I think Dennis told me this, that we want a lot of pictures in the book, because some people would really learn more from the photographs and not the text, or at least not all the text. So there's some 200 pictures in the book, and with all color and large size if we need it, because of the help we got from Wyoming. But if you don't want to go back there, you don't have to. But Dennis also expanded his captions. And for most science stuff, like I do and he does, they like short captions in science papers. And Dennis had these thicker ones. And I said, Dennis, why do you have all this? Well, because some people maybe will look at the picture and they don't want to read all the text, but they can read the caption and sort of get the general message. So I think you could go through the book if you didn't want to read the whole book, and get through it and look at the pictures and the captions and get a really good idea of what the ecosystems of the Dakotas are like, and something about their past, present, and their future. So that's the way we structured the book. I think that we cover both states, and because, for obvious reason, South Dakota and North Dakota are a lot alike. They're certainly the same size, but they do have a different landscape history, and that does change things quite a bit. So there's more differences than you might think, but we certainly wanted to combine the two states, and because there is enough overlap to be able to do that. But it also means that I think you could be anywhere in those two states, almost anywhere. You could be in the Pembina Hills. You could be in some wilderness area in the Badlands. You could be fishing on a Wahi reservoir, and this book would have some information that would tell you more about it, because we do cover all the ecosystems in both of these states. So that was our intention to, in fact, the book is structured that way. It starts out with more physical processes and history, but it moves into the ecosystem. So there's a chapter on the Missouri River. There's a chapter on the Black Hills. There's a chapter on the Badlands. There's chapters that are identified by ecosystem. So you can pick out your favorite ecosystem and study that if you like. So some people also said taking it on a trip would be a good idea. It's a little large for a backpack, but it could be in the car, and when you get to a spot and you're at the campground and you're out in the Black Hills and you think, where did these come from? These hills out in the middle of nowhere. And they're pretty cool, but there's something must have happened to form these. And what about their history? And wasn't Custer out here at one time? Yeah, Custer was out here. So there's a whole bunch of information like that you could enrich your visit with, and have it last a lifetime, because you go to the next ecosystem next year and you can use the same book. So that's the way you save money that way, right? So now that's all I'm going to say about my thinking about the book structure and how it applies, and what our structure, or what our approach was in getting the book. But Dennis may want to add a few things. Or have I covered it? Did I cover your talk too, or do you have?
No.
Okay.
You have more.
No. The floor is yours.
Oh boy, you stuck to the 10-minute limit very nicely.
Did I? He's watching me.
Well, I too want to thank everyone who's contributed to this program. Michelle, Emmeline, it's a real treat to be here. See a few familiar faces in the audience. Folks from my hometown up in Clear Lake. Carter told you a little bit about the the origin of the idea for this book, but he didn't say how long it took us.
I don't answer that question.
Well, I think it's important to know because in a way it's a good thing that it took a long time. This book is only about 1 inch thick. You wouldn't think it'd take 25 years to write something like that, would you? We probably started thinking about this in the late 1990s, and our original, we thought about it over the course of a couple of years when I'd come out here and start hunting, and Dave Bartling would encounter me out in the Dual County somewhere and make sure I had my license on me, and after a while we became very good friends. There were times I thought we were the only two hunting in the Dual County. Or either that or he was following me around everywhere. Bound to get even with that guy with the out-of-state Wyoming license plate. But Carter, you know, to begin with, we thought we'd probably finish this in about 5 years. Took 20 years longer. That's, of course, partly because Carter's so busy. I was fully retired, but I was busy with woodworking and a few other things.
I was out hunting.
Oh. Dave, you're retired now. Good thing. You ought to be watching out for this guy. But anyway, 5 years went by and we'd barely accomplished an outline. We had a few things written, and we thought that maybe we may need a couple of years longer. But that stretched out for another 20 years or so. And now I think back on it, Carter, that was a blessing in disguise. Because think of all of the things that have happened in that last 20 years. If we published the book on schedule, it would be out of date by now. What has happened? Well, during that time, human-caused climate change has become well accepted throughout the scientific community. The IPCC reports wouldn't have been available to us. All that extensive, very thorough, peer-reviewed climate change modeling would not have been accomplished, and we wouldn't know nearly as much as we do now. As a result of new paleological research, we know that there have been droughts in North America that lasted far more than the droughts of longer than the droughts of the 1930s. 40, 50 years, not just 10 years or so, 6 to 10 years. So it's, some have concluded that the droughts that occurred back in those times were too long and too severe to sustain the kind of agriculture that we have going on in South Dakota today. We wouldn't have known that 20 years ago. Restoration ecology was just beginning at that time, and now people are talking about tallgrass prairie restoration. And a lot has been learned about that during this time. It has elapsed since we started talking about this project. The whole concept of ecosystem services, the benefits that we derive from ecosystems, from natural ecosystems and ecosystems that have been managed very carefully. We now know that they are valued quite highly by some people, including some farmers and ranchers, and it's possible to sell some of these ecosystem benefits. It's kind of a new concept, relatively new concept. We know about selling commodities, but how do we sell ecosystem services? The word Anthropocene was not used at that time. Now it's viewed as a time in geologic history, well recognized by members of the Geological Society of America, that now humankind is one of the most significant factors affecting what's happening on Earth, the whole planet, including the climate change. The whole idea that humans could be modifying the climate of the Earth as a whole, including South Dakota, is probably the most stunning revelation of our time, of our lifetimes, of Carter's and my careers. It's just hard to believe. The idea of selling ecosystem services is novel. It's a concept that's connected with the idea of conservation finance. How you can make money off of managing your land a little bit more carefully to benefit wildlife habitat, to maintain soil fertility, and all of that. I have a quote, but on the other hand, we've got obviously to continue growing food for the rest of the world, and I have one quote that I wanted to read to you here from our preface that it sums up our approach to writing this. We're not talking about reconstructing necessarily the ecosystems that used to occur in the Dakotas, because we need to cultivate the land. That's the basis for our economy. So we wrote, we try to present a balanced overview of various land management problems and how they might be resolved, always considering the importance of sustaining agricultural economies while conserving soil and maintaining biological diversity. Our last chapter is about how to curb undesired trends, or how undesired trends might be curbed and degraded land restored. Now, so had we published on schedule, Carter, we wouldn't have had all that to include. And can you imagine trying to sell a book that doesn't include those kinds of topics, a discussion of those kinds of topics at that time? So it was a blessing in disguise.
Should we just wait 20 years now and write another one?
Oh, yeah, I don't think they're going to learn
We're not
much
gonna
more.
do that. Okay.
No, not me anyway. Now, Carter mentioned the title of the book, and I want to let you know that that was not an easy decision, partly because the publisher wanted to have a say about it. For example, they weren't too keen on having Dakota in the title. They wanted it to be Northern Great Plains, bigger market. We compromised by including North Dakota as well as South Dakota. The market is a little larger.
North Dakotans that, though.
No, that's a bit facetious, because we actually had thought that combining the two states would be a good idea, but the publisher, Yale University Press, thought that more books would be sold to libraries and around the region throughout the Northern Great Plains if Northern Great Plains was the title, not the Ecology of Dakota Landscapes. But we argued that, no, this is important, because I think more people will read the book if they know that it's about their state where they live. I wanted to think anyway that there are as many people who would like to read an ecology book about their state as there are who would like to read a geology book about their state. Most states have a book on the geology of their home state, or of their state. And most states have a book on the history of their state. We'd like to think that a book on the ecology of their state is interesting to a lot of people as well. So we were successful in keeping that title the way it is, knowing, of course, and hoping, of course, that people would recognize that what is going on with regard to North and South Dakota is pertinent to neighboring states, those adjacent parts of the neighboring states as well. Also, the publisher was concerned is putting ecology in the title too technical. A lot of people don't know what ecology is, they thought. Well, we think that a lot of people do know what ecology is. It's a science. It's not an advocacy group or discipline. It's a topic that is now becoming far more familiar to many people, and we want more people to know about what ecology is, and we try to demonstrate that. It's not an advocacy discipline. It's a discipline to understand ecosystems, the land better, so that we can do a better job of managing them. And also, some people thought, well, how are you going to write about the ecology of North and South Dakota without writing about agriculture? Well, croplands are ecosystems too. And there's a whole discipline of ecology that's known as agroecology. a lot of agricultural scientists are very much oriented to taking an ecosystem approach. Just because we're studying ecosystems does not mean that we're just studying natural ecosystems. We're studying all kinds of ecosystems, considering the human effects of mankind as well. Also, we have the comments of one reviewer. When the first drafts of the manuscript went out, one reviewer came back and said, "Your title does not include the word future." Carter and I had thought a little bit about that, but didn't want to put ourselves out on a limb by thinking that we could predict the future. Our crystal ball is not necessarily better than anyone else's, but on the other hand, and we were a little hesitant about trying to think about what probably could happen. But on the other hand, Carter and I are very interested in conservation, obviously. And if you're interested in conservation, you're thinking about the future automatically. What's the point of doing conservation if you're not thinking about the future? So we agreed, and future is in the title. The title has a subtitle, The Ecology of Dakota Landscapes, Past, Present, and Future. Everybody understands that to understand the present, we need to understand what has happened in the past. That at least can be helpful. But on the other hand, projecting into the future is less common. But now with the projections for climate change and recognizing that climate affects everything, our housing and our businesses and the way we build roads, as well as what goes on in nature, in the natural world, out there outside in the country, that's important for us to know as well. So the title of our book includes that subtitle, Past, Present, and Future, and we try to interpret what the implications of climate change might be. So if we've made a mistake, well, you'll know. If you live long enough, you'll know whether we got it right or not. Finally, last night Carter and I and our wives were sitting around, Judy and Janet were sitting around visiting, and Janet asked, what is the most significant thing we learned about while writing our book, that we the authors learned while writing our book? And Carter, of course, had something right on the tip of his tongue, and he spoke eloquently about it, and I was sitting there rather dumbfounded, not sure quite what to say, and it bothered me a little bit last night. And when I woke up, I said, I got to think of a good answer. Well, it is very easy, because I think that the most significant thing I learned is that agriculture, that cropland, can become a significant player in sequestering carbon dioxide. Right now, most people, I dare say, think that agriculture is a source of carbon dioxide. That if we plow the land in certain ways, or we farm the land in a certain way, that in fact we are contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere because there's so much carbon stored in the soil. And when we break up the soil, that organic matter decomposes more rapidly, and it becomes a source of carbon. But there are now procedures that are being developed by agricultural scientists that collectively are becoming known as regenerative agriculture. There's a way of managing the land so that the agriculture can be become a source, a sink. That is, it can sequester carbon in the soil rather than releasing it. Now, that doesn't say it's perfect, but we can do a lot better than we are now in some places. So I think that probably is the most significant thing that I learned. And that the idea that agricultural land, which extends covers so much of our state, croplands that are cultivated, maybe almost half the state. And if you think of the rangelands and so on, they can all be managed so that they tend to sequester carbon, or at least lose carbon more slowly. which is could be as significant as using energy more efficiently in a city, because we're using electrical powered vehicles, or because we use them use more solar and wind and so on. So I think that is a significant thing that we've learned. Also, we've learned that there's a potential for restoration where that seems appropriate, and that can be profitable. Like I said, it's possible to think about selling ecosystem services. But who pays for that? Well, there are ways that all of us can be involved in doing that. In closing, I'd just like to read one other portion here, a quote from Wendell Berry. Who wrote, "Change will continue," and he says, change will continue because lots of changes have occurred in agriculture over the years. Just think about all the things that have happened since the Dust Bowl years. Well, he said change will continue. There are reasons and viable options for doing better. However, as the agrarian philosopher Wendell Berry asserts, it won't happen unless a lot of people, consumers and producers, city people and country people, conservationists and land users get together deliberately to make it happen. Well, he wants us to all sit down with everyone involved and think about how are we going to make this work. We'd like to think that our book maybe will contribute to that discussion. So that's what I'll say for now.
Should we begin questions now? So, any questions out there? There's one. Nels?
Are you gentlemen optimistic about the future?
Are we?
There you
Gentlemen optimistic about the future?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what I think about it is that we're learning so much now. I mean, we know we've made a lot of mistakes. We've probably cultivated too much land in the grassland. We probably should have stopped at some point and had better balance. But we as Dennis has said, we now know so much more about restoration. We can't duplicate what we've removed, but we can get many of the properties back, and especially by converting grassland back. You won't get the 200 species of plants back, but you might get 50, and you'll get the same, not the same, but a good functional back. So I tend to think that, and hopefully we're going to start using more of that knowledge to start going back, building better the other way. Instead of continuing to lose, which we have been, let's reverse it. And just like the Keeling curve of CO2 is another thing we need to level off. But no, I've always been optimistic about, just because I know there are people like many of you who really fight for this stuff and go to meetings and join organizations and write about it in newspapers, and that I think I'm very optimistic about it. Dennis?
Yeah, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. I agree with Carter. I tend to be optimistic about it. I feel like we have to be optimistic because what's the alternative? To be pessimistic is not going to lead to the motivation to do better. And we're involved in a grand experiment, and here in the Dakotas we have certain kinds of challenges that we should try to do the best we can.
I'd like to follow up on your answers to that and Wendell Berry's quote, both. One of your themes, maybe the dominant theme in the book, was ecosystem degradation. And in every chapter you talked about sustainability and at a landscape level some things that people can do. But I think after reading the book, a lot of people are going to say, well, sort of the donut hole in the book, because you've got these small urban and town ecosystems that kind of pockmark the Dakotas. And what should we be doing as individuals and as communities?
I'll leave that for him.
Well, I think we have to empathize more with the challenges that our farmers and ranchers are facing. Probably we need to be thinking about how much we're willing to pay for conservation activities. If our focus is on wildlife, we need to recognize that there's a reason that our ditches are being plowed in some cases, that fences are being taken down, that shelter belts are being not being replaced. Maybe they shouldn't be, and I'll mention something about that in a minute. We got to recognize that one of the ways that we're affecting our lands is the most widespread way that we are affecting the land is through our agriculture, but that we have to play a role in maybe paying higher food prices, be willing to pay higher food prices so that farmers can do more. Maybe they can put more land into wildlife habitat if that's important to us, or if we think that the stream water is not as clean as we'd like to, well, then we probably can look to the farmland, the cropland, as a cause of part of that. It means also that if we are going to ask farmers to do better with regard to controlling their erosion from their lands, we've got to probably do better with making sure that the water that goes into our streams from our cities is better. So it may mean saying being really willing to pay higher taxes to provide better sewage treatment plants or whatever, because we're contributing a lot of problems. We're creating a lot of problems as well. We got to think in terms of how we can work out the financing of all of this somehow. Everybody in Wyoming certainly doesn't want more taxes. I imagine that's not too different from Wyoming, the Dakotas. But on the other hand, I don't see any other way of accomplishing some of these things without providing more resources for what we think is the right thing to do. We can't just talk about it. We've got to be willing to put some skin in the game.
Carter, you should talk about what you've done in our own yard.
Oh. Well, yeah, Janet says we've done a few things in my own yard. That we have some buffalo grass. We have buffalo grass lawn in my yard, and in the back. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I mean, you can start at that scale and start trying different things, and it does have an impact though, because I have never watered it except to start it. So I'm using less water from the brooking system. It's cheaper that way, but it doesn't use the resource so much, and it also it's a beautiful lawn, and it tolerates certainly the summer drought and so on. But you could do all sorts of things in terms of pollinators, and that's a big subject now. Is if the farms aren't producing what we need for nectar and flowers for bees and butterflies, and there's less of that on farmland now, we could do it in towns. And I've got bees and butterflies all over my place, and I know a lot of you do the same thing. And I mean, that is a very local kind of scale, but maybe it would be an example of what you could try to do at a bigger scale, as Daryl is suggesting there. That's a real tough question. I at times I think to myself too, we're all stakeholders in our land. We have private property rights, and those go deep in America, and they should. But I think we should have some say on what goes on farmland, and we do through legislation. And maybe the farms should have somebody say on what goes on in cities. But we should be sort of working together, and instead of being in opposition. And if we could do that, that would be nice to see. But that's the question of the next decade to work on, Daryl. Tagir.
I know you for 48 years. And you keep surprising me every...
Is that good or bad?
But you surprised me today once more. And the reason is, at the end of your presentation, you did not mention electronic copy of the book. I have real difficulties placing any new book in my library. The future is with electronic book format. So would it be available and when?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Where it's available? Yeah, all online booksellers, so Amazon and Walmart, and so yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's it's sort of complicated getting a book out of Yale and getting it into a store. There's a lot of rules about what they can sell and what they can't sell, and so the online booksellers jumped on this right away, and you can get an electronic copy as well. So you could take your electronic copy with you in your car when you're out camping, and you wouldn't have to have the heavier book. That's a good idea.
There's plenty of
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, we are selling books here, aren't we? We're supposed to be booksellers. Hello.
Hello, so Carter, what was the most significant thing that you learned from writing this book? Dennis shared his, and I'm curious about yours.
I think for me, even though I've lived here most of my life, but writing about a lot of things that places I haven't visited, even haven't been to, but it's some new places that I learned about that I didn't have much information on, but I also got to feeling that there's a lot of nature left in the Dakotas. We can get too much down on it and say, well, we're plowing up more grassland, and that is true, and it's unfortunate, but there's some beautiful places still left here, and but probably we should get going, like the Nature Conservancy wants to do, is save the best places that we have left, and so we can begin to spread those out in the future. Once we get into the restoration world and we can do it better, and we can begin to benefit more from it, because all these services that we've lost and get them back, then I think things are going to be a lot better. So really, I think it's the fact that Dakotas are an incredible place still, even though they've been hammered in some places and worked over pretty hard. But there's a lot of nature left, and but it's still left. But we could continue to lose it if we don't get back up going this direction instead of this direction.
I'd just like to add that something else that I think is significant, or that I enjoyed learning, is more about trees on the farm and windbreaks and shelter belts and so on, and all the reasons why people planted trees. We have actually more trees in Wyoming now, and South Dakota and North Dakota now, than at the time that first European immigrants came to this region. More trees. You can't drive almost anywhere without seeing trees off in the distance. That was not the case when Lewis and Clark came through here, for example, through the Dakotas. And so there was a natural tendency for people of European descent to want to have trees around them. And planting trees just was psychologically beneficial. And it also provided a source of wood for fuel, and as well it provided shelter and a sense of shelter from the sun and the wind. And so, and then of course during the Dust Bowl, or right after the Dust Bowl, we have thousands of miles of shelter, windbreaks being constructed with public funds. That was a way of using, that's conservation finance. It was made sense at that time, and it still does. In fact, you can go online and find websites on how to restore your windbreak. Those windbreaks have to be maintain themselves pretty well for a long time using solar energy and nothing more. But on the other hand, those trees are only going to live for a certain time, and also those trees are now starting to get in the way of big machinery, and so that when they die, some farmers are hesitant to replant them because that land can be cultivated for their commodity, for their crop. Now, it's natural for us to think that reduces habitat diversity, so it's not going to be so good for wildlife, for example, or it's not going to be so good for controlling erosion or providing those services, those ecosystem services that the windbreaks provided to be, that they were the reasons they were planted. But on the other hand, one of the most significantly endangered group of birds is our grasslands birds. Many of them are much less abundant now than they had been previously. Well, you don't benefit grassland birds by planting trees in their habitat because it provides resting sites for raptors that prey on those birds. So some wildlife biologists are recommending, look, if you've got grassland around your shelter belt now, or you intend on restoring that cropland to grassland, maybe because you'd rather raise beef or protein rather than carbohydrate seed crops, then you shouldn't plant trees because you're creating habitat for species that make it difficult to reclaim grassland birds, grasslands and grassland birds. They become essentially ecological traps. If they're just a little island of grassland with a row of trees running through it, you're going to have fewer birds and fewer species than if you get rid of those trees. So there are those kinds of things to think about as well.
Other questions? Here?
What is the most pristine landscape left in the Dakotas?
The most pristine landscape left in the Dakotas.
We can certainly say what is not the most pristine. And quite possibly nothing is pristine.
I think I saw it in the 2 times in the last 2 years. It's a ranch, the Bean Ranch. Some of you know that name. It's up on the top of the Prairie Coteau, the highest part of the Prairie Coteau near North Dakota. It's a ranch of 20,000 acres. 17,000 acres is grassland. And the owner took me up to get the picture on the front of the cover of this book. And that's the place. He took me up there and we looked around at things, and then he said, "Carter, you know, I've got an area up here. Maybe you want to look at it." And I said, "Well, what is it?" It's 6 square miles of grassland that's never been plowed, and it has all the wetlands that are there have never been drained. And I said, "Wow, that's got to be unusual." So if you look at your book, it's the picture on the frontispiece, which shows some wetlands and what they look like. And when I got there, I just about fell over. I mean, I've seen thousands of wetlands in our eastern South Dakota, and these did not look like those at all. Mostly their shorelines were vertical boundaries, and there were no cattails. And they did not look at all like the same species of wetland that we have around here. And what it is, there's a lot of erosion from our crop fields to go into wetlands. So you get the slopes and the mud flats formed. So when you go into most of our wetlands, you walk in and you got mud up to here. And these had none of that, and they were solid bottomed. And I think that spot and the 600 and the 6 sections of land around it probably would be my candidate for a place that's a glorious looking place.
Well,
So,
Carter, wasn't this cover photo yours?
Mhm.
That's on the Bean Ranch also.
yeah, that's it.
So
Yeah.
that's a picture of the bean ranch.
Yeah. And the frontispiece is if you go to the second page, you'll see those wetlands. And yeah, that's pretty amazing. And that's not the only. I mean, there was a lot of nature up there. And so here's a rancher who he actually is a biology teacher, the one that runs the ranch now. His brother and I went to college together. That's how I sort of know these guys. But they've always been conservation minded, and they live primarily as a cattle ranch. But he does have 3,000 acres of cropland. But he thinks every time he's always thinking about making the land better, and not making it worse in order to make a few more bucks. So
I would say that the Badlands are probably quite pristine once you get away from the roads. That's not they've been there for thousands of years. And if you can accept the idea that our livestock are somewhat similar ecologically as bison, which is debatable, or if you can accept the fact that if wide open spaces with rather few fences, with grasslands, that is, where you've got permanent year-round cover, and you can accept that lack of grizzly bears and wolves, then that would be and replace that with hunting to help maintain populations, then that could be considered, as you find West River country, I think those can be quite pristine if managed properly. In many cases, it's not the species of animal that's important when it comes to large herbivores like bison, it's the fences. But of course, fences serve an important function, and there's not a problem. It's just that so often we end up with too many animals in too small of a fenced area. That's the big problem. It's more the fence problem than it is the animal problem, as I see it. It's hard to find pristine ecosystems anywhere, but those come close, I think.
Any other questions?
We have time for one more.
One more question. There it is.
I'm curious about how you incorporate the indigenous history in your book. How do you incorporate the indigenous history of land in the book, and how do you see the relationship that the indigenous people share with the land, and how some of their conservation practices becoming part of the future?
The part of the book that focuses on the Native Americans the most is is in the Missouri River chapter, looking at the tribes that lived on the Missouri River and that met Lewis and Clark, and were the reason Lewis and Clark's expedition was successful. And we spend a fair amount of time looking at the culture at that time. We've also shown in the maps where all the locations are of Indian lands now, but we didn't do a lot of. We don't have a lot of information about those lands because there isn't very much about the ecology of the reservations. For example, the grasslands and the management and so on. And I guess we just ran out of. I mean, a lot of things we couldn't cover that we wanted to, but it's already 340 pages, and we tried to take the high spots. But it would have been. I wish we could have done more, but just reading that part of the on the Missouri River and what was going on. Well, the first corn farmers were the Native Americans, so not the Norwegians. So
Yeah, I would just like to say that in every chapter, I think we considered what could we add, what do we know that we could add about the effects that indigenous people had on the land. And they of course, we recognize them as the first farmers, and we recognize them, and we've reviewed a little bit of the anthropological literature on when the Native Americans arrived. The Paleo Indians first arrived in about 13,500 years ago. Their populations were very low, and they didn't have significant mechanical and chemical tools to manipulate the land. They used fire widely, but a lot of fires were started by lightning as well as by people, and so we didn't really need people. There were fires that burned through our grasslands long before people arrived. And so fire was nothing new, but it probably was new in the sense of where the fires were being started. We thought in terms of how could possibly hunters and gatherers meet people that depended largely on the bison for their food, how they would impact the bison herds, and it was hard to imagine that they could have had a large impact on the herds because they were so abundant at the time when we have history of human impacts on the landscape when that was written. And so what we did the best we could without becoming anthropologists, which we were not. But in every chapter, many of the chapters at least, we do think in terms of people, not whether they're European, what their race might be. And now today, we have some places where large grasslands are being restored off of the reservation, on the reservation. The Rosebud Reservation now is emphasizing the raising of bison more than livestock, and perennial grassland continues plant cover all year long, and so it's in some cases there's collaboration between the folks on the reservation and the folks on the adjacent land. So we did some of that, but still feeling a bit inadequate about how to know about the traditional knowledge that does certainly exist.
Are we out of time? Yeah, okay. The boss says we're out of time over here, so. Yeah. Well, thank you a lot.